Welcome to Building My Legacy podcast. This podcast is designed for leaders and entrepreneurs who want to leave a legacy and will provide strategies that focus upon key elements for legacy creation, determining your desired impact and its benefit, increasing your legacy's reach by engaging key stakeholders, planning, prioritizing, and executing. Here's your host, Dr. Lois Sonstegard.
Welcome, everybody, to today's Building My Legacy podcast. I have with me today Mark Rockwell. Mark is an interesting person in that he works with what many of us would consider one of the most difficult groups to work with, attorneys. So he works with attorneys to really help their law firms run more smoothly and to put their processes and systems in place so that things flow and work well. He gets rid of the frustrations that attorneys have in their practices and puts that optimism perhaps back into their work. So, Coach Rockwell, Mark, tell us, how did you get started in this, and what was it that brought you to this avenue of work?
Well, good afternoon, Lois, and thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast. It's an interesting story in that I went through law school and got my ticket punched in the state of Washington, passed the bar. But while I was going through law school, I really realized that I enjoyed business more than I enjoyed law. So I really went into building over my career a number of different businesses. And during the last organization I built, starting in 2008, which was a healthcare company, I was introduced to the idea of an operating system, EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System. And it really helped us in our organization. I could see how a lot of the things that we'd been doing just ran a whole lot smoother. There was more clarity. There was more focus. We were better at executing once we introduced the operating system. And so when I sold the majority of that company in 2019, I decided, gosh, I have no interest in retiring. I think it would be really fun to work with organizations who have similar frustrations to those I experienced. And I'm going to begin sharing this with other organizations. Well, about that time, I started getting calls from attorneys. Mm-hmm. I knew because they knew I was an attorney and they knew what I was doing. And they said, hey, how about you come help us? And so it really, I kind of backed into the space of working with law firms, probably because I've done a lot of legal work, even though I've never hung my shingle out as a private attorney. But I kind of think like an attorney. I've been trained as an attorney. And, you know, Lois, once you crack the hood on most law firms, you see a certain level of frustration and confusion and chaos under the hood. And that's not because lawyers aren't bright. It's not because they aren't really dedicated to their trade. But as a matter of fact, even today, only 14% of law schools teach anything about running a law firm. Isn't that amazing? 14% of law schools say anything about the fundamentals of running a law firm. Wow. So what that means is you have all these thousands of attorneys who have graduated from law school, who are great at their trade. They're great technicians. They're great lawyers. But when it comes to starting and running and organizing a law firm, they are really ill-equipped. And so that's really where I spend my time and focus. And I have to say, it's extremely gratifying.
So, you know, Mark, that is not uncommon just with attorneys. We see it with medical practices, physicians. We see it with chiropractors. We see it with a lot of the professional people in that their trades do teach them to be exceptional at their trade. But to run the business, no, they don't get taught that. And then there's market forces that can be overwhelming. So talk a little bit about what those frustrations are and how you come in to help deal with them.
Well, so let's start out by saying that the principles of running a law firm are really very little different than running any business. Now, that's not totally true, of course, but let's start back with the basics. In any business, there are really three major buckets. One is get the work. The second is do the work. And the third is get paid for the work. And what lawyers and law firms are trained to do is do the work. That's their training. It's all about doing the work, but it has little to do with how to get the work or how to get paid for the work. So it's not uncommon in any business for two or three bright people to go out and start a business because they have a product, they have a service, and they put all their energy into providing that product or service. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, I guess I should say, they get some sales and they add some people. And then they get some more sales and they add some more people. And what started out as a very small, informal operation that they could kind of keep in their head, it's now getting a lot more complicated and a lot more confusing, I should say. And so because there is no real business plan, it really starts to become chaotic. And I use the corny illustration, but you'll get the point. It's like three people start a business and they go to a trade fair and they come back and they have 15 business cards and they just throw them in a box. Mm-hmm. And you walk in and say, hey, we saw that guy with Ted, whatever. Do you have his card? And I rummage through the box real rapidly and I hand it to you in a matter of no time. And I'm quite pleased. And you walk away with his contact information. 5 years later, you walk into my office. Now there's 5,500 cards in the box and it's still just one big pile. And you ask kind of the same question. And I offer to find the card, rummage through the box for 30 minutes and can't find it. Well, that's metaphorical for how most businesses are organized. They get started and we just sort of throw the card, so to speak, in the box. And at some point, it doesn't work anymore. The amount of effort it takes to accomplish any single task is just simply overwhelming because there hasn't been any process or any procedure put in place. And the old saying goes, and I believe it to be true, you can't scale until you can achieve consistency.
Yes.
And you can't achieve consistency until you have process and procedures in place. So in the context of a law firm, they start out with one or two people, each attorney's doing their own thing, but there is no consistency. And so then when they add another associate, they add a paralegal, everybody is kind of marching to their own drummer, and it becomes pretty frantic and pretty confusing pretty quickly. So what we do is I sit down first and foremost with a law firm, and as I would with any business, and we talk about who are they, what are their goals, what are their values, what do they want to be, what do they want to focus on, who does their customer look like, who are they attempting to serve? And oftentimes there's really a lack of agreement even on those very fundamental core aspects of the firm. And so once we work through that and we get agreement, then we can move on to the more esoteric things such as process and procedures. But that's really where we start with every organization is who are the right people? What are you trying to do? Who are you trying to serve? And lights start to come on.
The lights start to come on because people begin to see hope. I think one of the discouraging parts about business for many professional groups is feeling so overwhelmed and stressed in keeping up that there's a fear of making the right decision. So having somebody come in and help sort is huge, isn't it?
Well, yes. And what's interesting, and at the risk of sounding falsely humble, even yesterday, I was talking with a client and they were explaining a situation to me that to me seemed pretty obvious and pretty easy. And after we walked through it for 10 or 15 minutes, the individual said to me, "Oh, that's gold. That's just gold." And you know what, Lois, what I said to myself after I hung up, I thought, you know, if I had been in his position, even today or yesterday, if we had role reversed, I don't think I would have had the clarity of thought that I did, because I would have been in the position of feeling overwhelmed with all of these issues. And so what I was able to provide, not because I was smarter or more capable, but because I was one click removed. It's sort of like I'm flying over his house and I can see his ceiling or his roof. I can see his driveway. I can see all of the issues going on in his domain, which he couldn't see. And that's what happens when I work with any client, is I'm able to bring, first of all, perhaps a level of calm, a level of third person objective advice, and really just help start sorting through the issues so we can say, okay, what's most important? Where are we hung up? What's the pinch point? What's frustrating you most? And how do we start to get this organized? And more often than not, it actually isn't terribly complicated. It's just a matter of focusing on it and making it happen.
You know, focus is so huge, isn't it? And yet it's one of the most difficult things to do when you are scattered and going every which direction. And most firms have dollar amounts that they want their attorneys to meet, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Lots of pressure.
Yeah. So under pressure, to look at how do you sort, the sorting becomes less important. Nobody pays you to sort.
You know, but back to that focus issue. This is an acronym actually that came to mind probably 3 or 4 days ago. I am a person who's always striving to make things simple. And I thought, you know, there really are only 3 or 4 things that we always need to be putting our emphasis on. And so I came up with an acronym that I call FACE. And I like it because I think of the little smiley face, you know, that we always see with the big yellow circle and the smile. And so the acronym I came up with was FACE. The first F is focus. A is for accountability. C is for clarity. And E is for execution. And the reality is, if we can do those 4 things, we can focus, we can hold people accountable, hold ourselves accountable. We have clarity, and I can get back to that in a minute, of who we are, what we are, and who we serve. And then lastly, execute. It's amazing how smoothly things go. But it does, to your point, Lois, start with focus. And that is a struggle that every bright entrepreneur and professional suffers from. And I think it's for 2 reasons, actually.
Okay.
One is because by our nature, we are bright people who are stimulated by new ideas, new opportunities, new activities. They're ever so exciting. But the other, actually, and I only recently came to this conclusion, and that is that when we grab at something new, a new client, a new idea, a new service, a new product, it's a hedge against failure. And I don't know that we have necessarily consciously thought about that. But if I add a new product or a new service, it seems kind of in the back of my mind that if this other product or service I'm offering was to wither or go away, I've kind of got this other idea that I could work on. And I don't know that that is something that necessarily percolates to the surface of entrepreneurs and attorneys, but it is a hidden motivation that I do think is present, but it runs juxtaposed to our success. Every organization that is really, really successful always has, I believe, 2 qualities. One is focus and the other is discipline.
I think you're right. And I think, so let's talk, we've talked a little bit about focus, talk about discipline, because you take a look at professionals and you think of them as being very disciplined. They could not have achieved what they have. They couldn't have gotten through their educational programs without discipline. And you are right. Discipline is a struggle once you get into the world of work. Why?
Why is it a struggle?
Yeah.
Well, I think because we suffer from a lot of distractions and we suffer from a lot of pressures. And so our natural, we have a lot of competing natural tendencies. One is we want to be satisfying. We want to be helpful. We want to be successful. To some extent, we are a bit frantic. We oftentimes don't stop and actually give ourselves quiet time to organize ourselves. And I will say as a side comment, if there is any one thing that I can attribute my personal success to, and I say that with modesty, it's the fact that I happened into this habit years and years ago of having a couple hours of quiet time every morning for my prayer and reflection and organization. And I know that's a luxury. Not everybody can set aside a couple of hours, but I have to tell you, I'd rather get up at 4:00 in the morning and have 4 to 6 as my own private time. I know it means 2 hours less sleep, but those 2 hours of thoughtful time for reflection and prayer and day planning are the most special, most productive 2 hours of my day. And I probably got that inspiration from two sources. One, I grew up on a dairy farm, so I always had to get up early. And also my Grandma Rockwell, who was just an absolute saint, always got up early and read her Bible starting at about 4:00 in the morning. So I had a terrific role model. But if we can take that time in the morning to first and foremost organize our day and list down the top 3 things that we absolutely need to get done, and set that 3 most important items aside from all of the other myriad of tasks, and then focus on those 3 items, that is a great start toward discipline. But it all begins, I think, at least selfishly speaking, with giving yourself that time in the morning to get organized. I don't know how you can be terribly disciplined if you're not mentally organized.
You know, I think there's 2 reflective times that for me, I've learned over the years are incredibly important. And one is those early hours. I'm like you, I get up early and it's my time of quiet and reflecting, and then evening also to close the day with that. Because if you don't, what I find is then I spend the rest of the night continuing my problem solving. And I wake up exhausted. But if you go through that quiet time reflecting what worked, what didn't work, what do I do differently tomorrow? What lives did I impact positively? Instead of going to bed with your list of negatives, you go to bed with a list of what really worked and how you're going to add value tomorrow, which changes your I think, the way you sleep. What have
It does indeed. To answer your question earlier about discipline, I wrote a little ebook, a little very quick read called 5 Mistakes Lawyers Make That Kill Their Careers.
I love the title.
I would gladly send that to anybody who asks for it for free.
We will put it, by the way, in the show notes with a link so our listeners can get it. So thank you for that offer.
And so what it really comes down to is, and I cite that now or refer to it now because it talks about in the context of discipline. And while attorneys are in many respects very disciplined, it's really easy to become undisciplined in a matter of your own time management, how you allow yourself to become terribly distracted. And a lot of that is the result of modern technology. So the first thing that most of us do, and I speak about this not in the context of someone who has mastered it. So I'm not being at all smug. It's a struggle I have and we all have. Is number one, controlling the use of our cell phones. We go to work, we set our phone to the side, but we hear it beep, we hear it chirp. And man, is it tough to not turn it over and see who has texted us or who has emailed us. That's just human curiosity. So you can either choose, as an example in that case, to continue to be distracted, but come to the realization that every time you break your train of thought, it takes you anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes to spool back up to your optimum efficiency. So if you're writing a brief or a summons or a complaint, or you're trying to problem solve, you're trying to write a will or an estate plan, if you allow yourself every couple, 3 minutes or every 10 or 15 minutes, or even every half hour to look at your emails, look at your texts, what that does to your efficiency and the number of additional hours that you have to work to get the same workload accomplished is really compelling. I mean, when you really stop to analyze it and to put math to it, in the course of a year, it represents tens of hours of additional work. That's hours that people are spending at the office late, coming in early, feeling frustrated, and feeling defeated. So when you take that in tandem with number two, allowing your career or your colleagues to interrupt you, another big setback. So emails, colleagues, unplanned phone calls from clients, unscheduled meetings from clients. You take all 5 of those items, and in the course of a day, you are just poking holes in your efficiency every 10 to 15 minutes. And it's little wonder that attorneys are frustrated, working long hours, and frankly, beginning to hate their job.
It's interesting, those statistics that you quote, because we're hearing the same thing from people who are working from home, whether it's attorneys, other professionals, or people in business, professionals in the business world. They feel compelled to respond to every email message that they get because they want to make sure that people know they're working. And so there's that pull of how do I show that I'm fully engaged and working, and yet keep myself focused and get the job done.
Well, you're right. I mean, we want to be known as working. We want to be known as being on point. But there are some very fundamental things that we can do that can be actually quite life-altering. One would be, as an example, just being open and honest in communication with your colleagues and saying, I'm going to work between 8 in the morning. I'm just citing this obviously as an example. I'm going to work from 8 to 11 every day. And I'm not going to take any phone calls or any email messages during that, or I'm not going to respond to any email messages between 8 and 11. I will check my email at 11:30 or 12, and but be assured I will respond to your email before the end of the day. So I think a lot of it and that's just an example. If I sent you, for instance, an email, and even though I might selfishly want an answer in the next 10 minutes, that's just human. If I knew that Lois always gets back to me within 24 hours, then that's okay. Now, if it's urgent, I can probably text you, or I can do something different that alerts you to the fact that this is really a firehouse issue. But most of the communication that we deal with in a day-to-day basis is very routine, does not demand immediate impulsive response. And yet what we're doing is we're allocating our time, effort, and mental energies on a lot of items that don't justify it. And so we're taking, if you will, a $100 response to a $5 item. Well, if you're always giving a $100 response to a $5 item, at the end of the day, you've spent a lot of money on very little issue. And so there are very simple techniques, I believe, and I know for a fact that if your colleagues know that you have bracketed time, if your clients know you have bracketed time, as much as anything, what a client needs to know is that you will get back to them. You're not ignoring them. So there are some techniques that we can all adopt that allow us to be more efficient by multiples, less frustrated, more responsive, and expend less energy.
Isn't that the truth? It's communication, isn't it? If you communicate what you need, you can actually do it. But I think sometimes fear that.
Well, but there's also a human nature, particularly, I think, Lois, with high tech. There's something fast about high tech that seems as though it demands a fast answer. But, we've always been guilty of this, because think of the situations where you've been sitting at the dinner table and the telephone rings. Honestly, you got to go answer the phone when you're sitting there with your family. Let it ring. Now, I would be probably the first to jump and go answer the phone. Honest confession. But there's something about technology when it beeps and it twerts and it whistles that says, I am the highest priority in your life. I demand your immediate attention. So if we're not going to react that way, what can we do? You turn your doggone phone off. If you don't want to turn it off, leave it in the other room. Turn all the whistles and bells off your computer. A lot of it is no different than the person who wants to lose weight. If you want to lose weight, don't have bags of junk food out on the counter. Take some preventative action. Think about it ahead of time. I know that all sounds very preachy, but it really isn't. It's just downright practical. And the profound fact, Lois, is at the end of a 2,200 hour year, it will make 300 to 400, maybe 500 hours of difference in how much a person needs to work. That is huge. Think of picking up an additional 500 hours that you could now spend with your kid at a soccer game, or actually take the weekend off, or actually get home for dinner at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock. It's the difference between whether you are frustrated and angry and want to quit practicing law, or you actually feel productive and happy.
It's a real dilemma of what I call the professional almost illness, in terms of really being stressed over the workload that is now being placed upon our professionals, doctors, lawyers, therapists. There's a whole group of people that fall into that category where work production is so important to their partnership, or any number of those things, or their payment.
And a lot of that, I do believe, extends to the our availability through technology. It used to be that if you were commuting between your office and your home, you had some quiet time. You were probably going to be listening to Frank Sinatra on the radio, but not anymore, because you are just as available when you're in the car. You're just as available at 11 o'clock at night as you are during the office day. That is, if you allow it. And so while I know the pressures are there, I do think that, as with anything in life, we have to set boundaries. Yeah. And if we don't set boundaries and we make ourselves available at 11 o'clock at night, and we immediately respond to emails at 11 o'clock at night, I can assure you that client that is in London is going to expect answers at 11 o'clock at night. It's not 11 o'clock at night where they are. It's 9 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
So we have to take responsibility to balance being proactive and service-oriented with creating boundaries. And why is that important? It comes down to maintaining life balance and, frankly, good mental health. It's really that serious.
Mental health has become a huge issue. We're almost out of time. And before we conclude, I want you to speak a little bit about your law firm organizational checkup, because I think it's a clever concept.
Well, what it'll do is it will talk, there's 25 questions. It won't take a person probably more than 10 minutes to fill out. You rate yourself on each of the 25 questions on a score of 0 to 4. And then you tally up the points. And it'll ask you questions about what's your meeting style? How are you managing your time? Do you have good measurements as far as your firm's performance? It's just really kind of fundamental, 25, what I call 25 fundamental questions. So here's the bad news and the good news. The bad news is most people who take it give themselves a fairly low score. Honest confession, when I took a similar organizational checkup 4 or 5 years ago, I had an embarrassingly low score. And I said to myself at the time, my gosh, how could I have been in business all these years and not known these things? So that's the bad news. The good news is when you look at all 25 questions, and most of them are pretty straightforward, it becomes your roadmap for, oh, well, if I'm not doing that, but I started doing it, I'd get another 4 points. And you can quickly see how over the next year or two, by making some fairly simple, fairly fundamental changes, your score can go from whatever it was all the way up to a very lofty score. And so it's good in both sense. It gives you sort of what I'd call the equivalent of a professional X-ray, but it also gives you the opportunity to see how you can get to a much more successful level with some just concerted effort.
I love the simplicity of it and the fact that you can create action, movement as a result of taking it.
Yes, and there's nothing in the checkup that people are going to look at and go, oh, that's impossible. I could never do that. I mean, one of the questions, which of course is pretty fundamental, is it talks about personnel, colleagues. Is everybody in your organization someone you'd rehire? And I have to tell you, oftentimes people go, yes. Oh, we're very happy with the people we have. And that's wonderful news, because if there are other aspects of the operation that are not that up to snuff, those are oftentimes pretty easy to fix. The people issue is obviously much more complicated.
Right.
But it's not uncommon for individuals to say, oh, no, we actually have very, very good people. We'd hire every one of them again. But yeah, we really aren't that organized when it comes to our processes. Yeah, we really don't have a very good idea of where we are financially. No, we don't really share where we are on, our core values. That probably hasn't been defined. And those things are, with focus, can be pretty quickly and pretty readily corrected.
Good for you. One of the things that Mark has offered, so for those of you who are listening, just so you know, is a link to his law firm organizational checkup. So you can take a look at that. And then, Mark, you made a further offer relative to that, that people could call and you give a free coaching session to the first 10 people.
Yes. One of the things I always like to do is, with no obligation whatsoever or no expectation whatsoever, is to say, if you want, you're welcome to call me at my cell number, 503-784-7205, or you can email me at Mark, M-A-R-K, at Coach Rockwell, CoachRockwell.com. And for the first 10 people who contact me, I would gladly volunteer an hour of my time. And oftentimes what I do is I encourage people to, first of all, take the organizational checkup. Because once they've done that, they have a sense of where they're really strong, but they also have a sense of areas where they might need some improvement. And that's where I can actually help them talk with an individual about actions, books, things they can do that can make their life more enjoyable.
Before we leave, anything that we've missed that is important for our audience to know, Mark?
Just one last thought, and I probably am guilty of being redundant. But if someone walked up to me on the street and said, "What is one piece of advice you can give me that's absolutely going to help my life?" I would say, focus. Now, I know that sounds by itself a bit hollow, but what most of us, rephrase that, one of the reasons most of us in business and in law become frustrated over is we're just chasing way too many items. And we're distracted by all the creativity and energy of new shiny objects. I would say, settle down, focus, think about what you really want to do and what you really want to excel at, and then put all your energy into that.
I love that, Mark, and it's a great note to end on. So thank you so much for being with us today on Building My Legacy podcast. And for those of you who are listening, thank you for being with us again. And remember to visit our website at www.buildwiththe2maro.com. And we will have the links to those two pieces that Mark offered, the 5 mistakes that lawyers make that kill their career, and then the law firm organizational checkup. So you have an opportunity to really take a look at that and then get in contact with Mark, because my goodness, you have a wonderful perspective and a spirit that I think is so needed right now. So thank you, Mark.
And thank you, Lois.
You've been listening to Building My Legacy podcast with Dr. Lois Sonstagard. To book your appointment with Dr. Sonstagard, visit www.buildtomorrow.com.